friend of mine who's a professional speaker would sometimes get up and he'd have a cup of coffee and he'd put some cream in it and he'd look around and he'd look up and he'd go, "What? I suppose when you get to the office, you go to work right away." So I need a little time to put on my glasses here. And while I was sitting here, I felt like my whole talk had just been sung. That's it. So if we do just get up and do it again, I could sit down. But God is present 24/7, 366. It sounds like a nice slogan. It's nice to say. Does anybody ever forget that besides me? And you know, it's because even though it's true intellectually, we get messages every day. We're caught in the trance of our own senses that make us feel that somehow all of this is solid and real and that it's inevitable and that the exterior is controlling our life. And that was handy because we're trying to survive out there in the physical world. And our ancestors, a few 100,000 millions of years ago, you know, they weren't necessarily that sophisticated at the beginning, and so they needed to find a way to get around without bumping into things. So my senses, my five senses, they give me information about the world that I live in. And so what really happens is, like, well, light comes in and it stimulates my optic nerve, and my brain wants to make some sense out of that, so it translates wavelengths into colors and shapes and all that sort of stuff. And the same with the auditory nerves. You know, sound goes bouncing around, or something goes bouncing around out of my mouth out there across the air, and it rattles our eardrums, and that rattles our little bones inside, and then the auditory nerve feels a vibration and translates that into an exterior experience. And you know, it's handy to have a navigation system if you're going to walk around. For instance, intellectually, I hear that I live in a round planet, but my daily experience looks like a flat world to me. Anybody there? Flat world, you know? Because it wasn't really important for our ancestors to know we lived on a round planet. It was important not to fall off cliffs and not to bump into trees and things like that. There was a writer named, I forget his last name, his first name, it was Seals, where I first came across this phrase, the trance of the senses. And we're caught in the trance of the senses, and I like it. It fit into some psychological concepts that I have that I didn't create, but I'm educable, so I learned them. And I believe we all live in a trance. It's a self-imposed trance of self-imposed limitations. And so we all limit ourselves far beyond what we could possibly do. And a good example, and I'm sure many of you have heard this, up until 1957, it had become an established medical fact that human beings couldn't run a mile in less than 4 minutes. Because many people had tried, and they tried and tried and tried, and they get very close and nobody could break the barrier. And then there was a British medical student, Roger Bannister, who thought it was possible. And there was a trainer in England who thought it was possible, and they got together and they changed their techniques based on the idea that this could be done. And Roger Bannister did break the 4-minute mile in 1957, but that's not the really important thing. What's amazing is, within that same year, 4 or 5 other people did the same thing. So an established medical fact, a scientific belief that was totally impenetrable up till 1957, until somebody got a different idea and showed that it wasn't true, and then everybody could do it. I can't, but, well, I don't know that I can. I used to believe people my size, my height, couldn't dunk a basketball. And don't be fooled, I'm not as tall as I look, it's an optical illusion. I'm not really 6'3". But anybody remember Spud Webb by any chance? I don't know, somewhere back in the 80s, I guess, he came into the NBA, and he's 5'7", about my height. Now, I'm not saying I'm a world-class athlete like he is. I mean, I've met professional athletes, and they're a different species. But I was a good athlete. I was a good athlete in college. I lettered in a couple of sports. And so I had believed I couldn't dunk a basketball, and I proved it the first 5 or 6 times I tried. And, you know, I didn't do it anymore. I just believed it. Now, I'm not saying I could have dunked it, but I'll bet I would have got a lot higher if I believed it was possible and put in more than half a dozen tries. So in order to get things done, we really have to have different belief systems. So we have a couple of different navigation systems. We have our physical senses that help us get around it. Another interesting thing about that is that the light spectrum is let's say about that big, if you were to graph it out, and our eyes can pick up maybe that much of it. It turns out we pick up the same things at the same frequency that bounce off the same things that we could bump into. Because my friend Jeff tells me that quantum physicists, particle physicists, tell me that the subelectronic particles, the subatomic particles that make up matter, between themselves, there's as much space between them relative to each other as there is between the stars in the sky. Which would mean that there is more space here than there is matter. More space here than, well, my wife claims there's more space here than there is matter, but that's another story. You want to see the view? Okay, so how could that be? Well, according again to quantum physicists, that the subatomic particles of the things that I bounce into, the reason I bounce into them is because my subatomic particles are vibrating at the same frequency. And the things that are moving faster than me, I just go right through them. The gases and the water. So isn't it handy that my navigation system only works with the things I could get hurt? Again, our ancestors needed this sort of thing. And so it plays in other parts of our life too. For instance, our other major navigational system is our feelings. And although we've all learned to have, we've heard the concept of have a different thought, change your thinking, change your life. A lot of people forget that really has a lot to do with feeling, because the power that moves this stuff is really feeling. And again, we've got this trance of the senses that makes us think all this is separate, we don't have anything to do with it, and it's all happening to us. So learning to change our feeling state is a real practical key in how to navigate in our greater world, which is the universal life that we live in. So because of our own personal histories, depending on the culture we live and different things, we've learned to pay attention to some things and make them really important no matter what's going on, and to not notice the other things. You can even see that in the structure of language. Like in English, if a red car goes by, I see a red car. My wife sees I don't know, I forget how to say car in Spanish, but right after car comes rojo. It's red. They see the object, then the color. We see the color, then the object. It sounds subtle, but you can see how that might change your impressions of the world. So when we're growing up, we learn to, first of all, when you're a baby, babies don't have any control over their bodies. They can't see something and grab it. They can't even figure out where it's going to go. The limb just kind of goes out there if you've ever been around a newborn. And we can imagine the same things going on in terms of the visual. And so at first, the baby's just having this stimulation of vibrational frequencies that it has to learn to discern. There's different colors, different shapes. And so by the time we're kids, if you're asked to draw a picture of a tree, most of us will draw, a brown stem and a green circle, right? Kids do that? Now, if you look at a tree, that's not really what it is at all. You see light shades of green and dark and even black in there and brown and all that sort of stuff. Because when an artist tries to paint a tree and make it look like a tree, it's not a round thing. But we've learned that that's what we're supposed to notice. So we learn what to notice and what not to notice. And based on our own personal history, that all gets affected too. What's important, what's not important. But we know we're the only thinkers in our own mind, right? And so we can change that, but we can't change it unless we know what's going on. So I'd like you to try something. Stick your hand out like this and close one eye. And then move your thumb back until it's touching the eye that's open. Okay, what do you see? All right, now move your hand back again. Back out. What do you see? All right, now move the thumb back into your eye again. Okay, you just made your thumb bigger than the entire universe, which is a good model for depression, because people get depressed because I'm not saying that there aren't things going on that I'm not unhappy about at times, but there's times we make the bad stuff, the stuff we decide is bad, the main thing. And so as we go through life, we're always making some things foreground and some things background. It turns out that human beings can only consciously hold 7 to 11 chunks of information every microsecond, whereas just our 5 senses are giving the brain about 10,000 pieces of information every nanosecond. And plus then there's memories and thoughts and things that remember. So there's a lot of information coming in, maybe 30 million, 30 billion pieces of information a minute. It's hard even to estimate it, but a lot more than 7 or 11. And so what we do is we take that 7 to 11 chunks of information, and we call that reality. And so that's what we're doing all the time. You know, we actually, our brain will Photoshop. And our vision is about like that big, and then we Photoshop what we expect to see based on, it's like the way a television, the modern ones will refresh themselves. You know, you buy them by how fast they cycle. They refresh themselves. So our picture's always being refreshed based on what we remembered, what we expected, what we did. And we might not even notice other things that are going on. Across the centuries, you know, whether they're separated by hundreds or thousands of years or by continents, all the mystics have told us the same thing. You know, if you get 20 psychics in a room and have them, if you could find 20 real psychics, and you have them examine something, most of the time they'll give about 20 different pieces of information. Kind of like the three blind men examining the elephant. You know, they'll have some of it. But the mystics have told us, again, separated by thousands of years and by continents, two things they've told us continuously throughout all the major teachings, and that is that, number one, we all come from one source. And two, we're immortal. So this is just a visit. This is the dream. Did anybody dream last night? Anybody go anywhere in a dream? And when you got up, were you tarnished or hurt or injured in any way by your dream? No, not unless you wanted to be and remembered it. And so there's a practical thing you can do about dreams, but there's also a practical thing you could translate it into your life. If you wake up in the morning from a bad dream, and anybody ever had a bad dream and then felt all anxious and worried and had a hard time shaking it? Well, when you're still in that semi-awake stage, close your eyes and go back as much as you can into sleep and rewrite the ending of the dream. And it will change your whole outlook in the day, because in that state, you're still in a semi-hypnagogic state where information comes in and you kind of take it as a post-hypnotic suggestion. So the things we tell ourselves first thing in the morning have a real powerful influence on how we go through life. Now, what this has to do with the idea that God's 24/7, 366 is that it's really true. It's as if there was this intelligence that is an incredible short order cook. And it's taking in your order for the next day for breakfast. Anybody here like poached eggs? Anybody here like coffee? Okay, so a couple of poached eggs, some coffee, a bagel with cream cheese, and I'd like somebody to treat me badly today. Your wish is my command. Okay, here it goes. I'd like somebody to remind me of my withholding my mother or my angry father, whatever the story in your life was. I just know there's stereotypes, but anybody do that? And so we go through life just dragging the past into the present, as if the dream was real, as if we have to keep reenacting it all the time. And the reason this happens, again, is because the trance of the senses allow us to forget that we're all connected. So sometimes we need actual practical physical reminders. So if you think about it, right now we are connected to physically and touching every other human being in the world. We're doing it with the atmosphere. Now, if I had a ruler and you held the ruler and we both pushed in the ruler, we'd agree we were connected, right? Well, we're connected through anybody not breathing that you're aware of anybody in the world? It's not very likely. And, we're either standing on the earth or something directly connected to the earth. And so in a very real physical sense, it's not just, an analogy. We're actually connected to everybody. And so if you take that a step farther, if we all come from one source, if we're all immortal, if there is an infinite intelligence that's creating me, maintaining me, sustaining me, and recreating me brand new in this brand new moment, and if that's true about you as well, that means that the perfect self, the spiritual prototype that this infinite mind is using to radiate itself through to create the physical us, that's a metaphor, but it kind of works for me. That means that there's nothing inside the real you that would ever want to hurt me or anybody else. And there's nothing inside the real me that would ever want to hurt anybody else in the world. It's only when I get confused and start believing the trance that I've built about my life, when I start believing that that's the truth and not the other, is when I feel separate and I start seeing some people as friends and some people as enemies, and there's dangerous others in other countries and things like that. And so there's some real value in knowing the truth, because I think it was, I can't remember his name, the person who wrote the 4T program. He pointed out it's not important to try and set things right. What's really important, what makes change, is when we learn to see things right. And again, my friend Reverend Jeff Lang, who was a physicist in another life, assures me that the things that I've read but do not have the mathematical knowledge to know if I'm just telling stories, because to prove quantum physics takes several semesters of calculus, and I seem to be short all several. But Jeff, and I sat across Thanksgiving dinner one time, one of my wife's cousins, her husband, his father was a retired particle physicist, astrophysicist from Caltech. And so at Thanksgiving, I was sitting beside him, and I told him, I think I can explain quantum physics, but I don't know if any of it's real because I can't do the math. So he had me explain it, and he said I explained it pretty well. And one of the things is there is now positive physical proof that our mind affects physical reality. And the one I'm most famous with is light. There's big controversy, there was a big controversy whether light is waves or particles. And so since an electron can be isolated, with light they would fire photons, a light beam, get electrons at a target. And you can record where light lands on film, and film's been around for a long time. So they set it up so that if light was a wave, it would go through one slot. And if it was a particle, it would have to go through the other slot. And they got varied results. And when they investigated further, they found out that if the experimenter truly believed that light was one way or the other, that's the slot it would go through. Not if they thought maybe, or not if they wished. Anybody ever wished and hoped as opposed to believe? Like when you want something to happen? Well, no, but if what they really believed statistically tended to show up more than would just be random. So if we can affect matter at the subatomic particle level, that means enough of that, we affect an atom. If we affect enough atoms, we affect molecules. If we affect enough molecules, we affect the world outside. And it doesn't have anything to do with time, space, or distance, because those only exist in this particular world. So I came across a quote from Ernest Holmes, and it had to do with physical reality in nature. And he points out it's the business of nature to receive the forms of thought which the spirit lets fall into it, and then things start to create. The illusion is never in the thing, but in the way we look at it. You've seen those pictures where if you look at it one way, it can be one thing. If you look at it another way, it can be... Well, when you're looking at it, the lines don't change. I mean, it's still the same stuff in the paper, right? It's just what we have decided in that moment to make foreground and background changes what we see, what we experience. And since there's, as I pointed out, we can hold 7 to 11 chunks of information while we're getting at least 10,000 and calling that reality. In a very real sense, we're making up our own holograph every single day. In a very real sense, we're making up the story of our life. In fact, it's shown whenever we have a memory. Memories are not this perfect videotaped experience that we used to think they were. Actually, every time we access a memory, when it stores back in, it's modified. We change it based on our current understanding of life, based on our current inner narrative. And it's our inner narrative that really defines our life. In fact, a lot of times you go back into the story, and you might, if somebody else was watching, they may not have noticed you being anywhere near as heroic as you remembered it, or nearly as bad if you remember it either. And so I suppose if we're making it up, we might as well make up something that empowers us, huh? All sounds like a pretty useful thing. Now, those, of course, are intellectual concepts. But as I pointed out, feeling is a big part of this. Because if you want to know what you really believe, check out your feeling in any moment, If you intellectually believe that life is good and everything works out, but you find yourself being anxious, maybe you don't believe that quite as much as you'd like to believe it. And trying to talk ourselves out of anxiety, I found, is a difficult thing to do. Anybody tried to talk yourself out of, it's okay, it's just, everything's just going to be fine, that's just a snake. So it's good to have some keys to turn to change our internal concept. And there's, people have heard me talk before, one of my favorites is to Picture in your mind the face of someone or someones for whom you hold unconditional love. Some of you it'll be your pets. Some of you it'll be your children. Might be your children when they were little. Might be right now. Might be your spouse. It can be more than one. And if you just picture their face and just imagine putting them in your heart for a moment, how does that feel? Doesn't it feel different than you felt maybe a minute ago? I mean, that's just nice and joyful. And so when we can get ourselves in that joyful state, then we can start focusing on what would be a better foreground, what would be a bad foreground. Two of my favorite writers in Science of Mind are Carlton Whitehead and Raymond Charles Barker. So I combined a couple of things they suggested you do if you want to bring a new experience into your life. Anybody have experiences you'd like to be different? You'd like it to be new? And knowing that, of course, our experiences are, everything's created twice, right? First in mind, or thoughts. I think everybody would agree before this podium existed in its present physical form, it existed in somebody's mind. And before this microphone existed in its physical form, it existed in somebody's mind. Clothing, my car. The circumstances of my life and your life before they existed in their current physical form existed in, right, the right answer is your mind. So, Barker points out every person living has made mistakes. New ideas take you the next step of the way. You are intelligence making right decisions, for you are directed by right ideas that are functioning in the now, and this is our power. Anybody ever notice that life is one long right now? I mean, yesterday, didn't it seem like right now yesterday when you were there? But now we're thinking about yesterday, but right now we're thinking about it. We're thinking about tomorrow, but right now. And when I wake up to Groundhog Day, I mean, it's just right now. Always one long right now. So, life never made a problem person. It made a person capable of handling problems. So there's a 4-step process here. And the first is, what do I want? Be really clear what you want. And then the second step is, decide it will happen. Well, that's actually part of the first step. A lot of people, you do what you want. People do the intention, but a lot of people forget to decide that it's going to happen. Anybody do that? Then we're just wishing and hoping. Anybody ever had a car that didn't start when you needed it to when you were in college? Maybe the battery was weak? You weren't surprised when it didn't start. You were just disappointed. And ever so grateful when it did, because then you weren't stuck out late at night or you could go to school or class or whatever, right? Just a nice reminder, you could be grateful every time your car starts, and that will change your mind too. That will change your emotion if you just remember how nice it is that you just turn this key in this thing, or if you have a button, you push a button and this thing goes. So you decide it'll happen. And so identify how I intend to act based on this new idea about myself. So for instance, if I say I'm going to go to Europe, but I don't have a passport, guess who's probably not really believing he's going to go to Europe? And people who are going to go to Europe even find their passports, don't they? Yes, they do. Kimberly shared that with us on Wednesday. So then what you need to do is identify every thought and belief that you have that's incongruent with getting what you want, because that thought needs to be released. A classic is people will come and ask me to treat for a relationship, and then they'll immediately declare that all the good ones are taken. Whoops, now we have a physics problem here. Two things can't occupy the same point, right? They either have to give up believing all the good ones are taken, or they have to give up wanting a relationship. So they get to decide which. But so you have to decide which of these ideas are incongruent. And then ask yourself, if what I wanted was going to show up in the next 24 hours, what would I want to have ready? For instance, if there's a realtor like Reverend Patricia in the house, she would know if somebody's going to sell a house, it's better to make it look good now, not tell the buyer how good it's going to look next week if they buy it. So what you would want is you'd want to have the house prepared for a potential buyer. If you're really going to sell a house, then you have to know there's going to be a buyer come in, which means you got to have it ready right now, not next week when you get around to it, when you see if there's a market, right? So if you don't have it ready right now, then you don't really believe you're going to sell it. You're wishing and hoping. And then we're subject to the laws of chance. And then the last step is act as if what you want is already happening, if it's assured. But remember, acting is not pretending. Acting is taking action that's congruent with your belief. I mean, again, if you thought you were going to Europe, of course you get a passport. If you were going to sell your house, of course you'd fix up whatever it is. So those are actions that are congruent with somebody who really believes what they say is true. So I'm going to leave you with one last story for your subconscious. I met a woman last night that I taught this to 25 years ago, and she'd been waiting to bump into me again so she could tell me how much it helped her life. So I'll share it with you. It has to do with some monks, and I don't know where they were, and I don't even know if it's a real story, but it sounds like a real story. Maybe one of those, what is it, apocryphal? Is that the word for things that everybody talks about but nobody really knows if it's real? Well, these particular monks, the way they would find nirvana is they would go into a building, long building, maybe hundreds of yards long. And it had two doors, one where you went in and they locked it behind you, and there was one at the very end in which it was open and you could open it and get out. That was the only way out. And they told them, when you're in that building, every fear that you have in life in your subconscious is going to manifest in three-dimensional reality. I mean, it's going to seem to you like it's really happening. You're going to be right face to face in a physical reality of your worst fears. And everybody got two pieces of advice for how to get through this. The second one was the one that helped, but everybody got two, so I'll give you the first one. The first one is they told them, remember, no matter what happens, everything that's happening is a product of your own mind. Anybody ever had a bad experience in life? Or going through a tough challenge? And did it help somebody to say, oh, it's just a product of your mind? Well, that may be true, but I still feel pretty bad, right? Well, the second piece of advice is what did the trick. So keep this in mind when you're intending and you're having somebody treat for you. The second piece of advice was simply this. Remember, no matter what happens, keep your feet moving. Namaste.